So, next we will be talking about reliability and regulation. We touched upon it this morning. If reliability is not there, then your lawmaker legislation might get into the space and tell you that you have to improve your reliability and basically hold you accountable for that. So our next panel will be on can regulation boost reliability? And I'd like to welcome 4 outstanding panelists that will cover almost the whole world in terms of regulation. So let's get started. First up is Maciej Mazur, who is the president of AVIR, the European Association for Electromobility.
Hi.
Please take a seat there. Second one.
Second one.
Thank
Good.
you. Next up, we have John Smart, who is director of ChargeX, the National Charging Experience Consortium in the US. Next, we have Lucie Mattera, Secretary General of Charge Up Europe. Big step. Oh, we need another chair. And finally, we have Matt Adams, Transport Policy Manager at Recharge UK. And we also get a chair. Please, Matt. So, I also got a chair. Welcome to all of you. It's great to see you. We had a very lively discussion a few days back. And I'd like to start. So we have the European space and the UK, no longer European space, and the US present here on stage. And first, to clear sort of the air, in the US, we have regulation on uptime, reliability. We will get into all of the words here. And in the EU, we don't have it yet. But I know that there are great efforts being made here that I would like to give some space to in the beginning. So, Maciej, why don't you start talking a little bit about Opportunity 35?
All right. I was not prepared to start with Opportunity 35. Thanks a lot for this kind invitation. It's great to be here in this wonderful place. So yeah, I think that we can start with Opportunity 35. That's a project that we, together with Charge Up, we're working on for the last couple of months. And by this project, we would like to encourage everyone that e-mobility is crucial not only for our green policies, but as well for our economy. And I know that this is obvious here, but not necessary in Brussels. So that's why we are focused on how we can influence GDP in Europe by e-mobility sector. And we believe that we can even gain here. We will do everything we can to have more jobs, to have more GDP percent being related to e-mobility. And that's why with the new Commission, with the new Parliament, and with the focus on economy rather than only on green regulations, we right now would like to underline how important it is to be focused on economy and what are the advantages of e-mobility. So how we can help automotive sector to be still as important for Europe in 2030, in 2040, as it is right now in 2024. It's crucial for us to see that it's extremely important to take care of all those issues and to have on board some politicians and other stakeholders and tell them that it's our chance. It's a huge chance for Europe to be a leader in e-mobility as well, not only in automotive industry, but to be a leader in e-mobility.
So it sounds like a lot more than reliability. Maybe you can share a little bit what is it that you do with the Opportunity 35, and also you've been smiling at Lucie. So how does Avir and Charge Up Europe here work together? Who do you represent?
Happy to take.
Can it be the first?
For this particular project, Avere and Charge Up have already joined up. We have a full campaign. There will be some events. One that is coming up in Poland very soon. We'll be unveiling a website. We're very excited to bring it to policymakers, to the industry. And we really want to keep the headlines around the transformation towards e-mobility positive. No one is bidding the case that e-mobility is good news for Europe, for the economy of Europe, so we've decided to do that ourselves and generate some numbers to support that claim. So that's what we will be bringing live very, very soon.
So looking at the whole industry that is present here today, who do you want to talk to? Who do you want to gain as part of for supporting the Opportunity 35?
Actually, the entire industry. All relevant players from automotive sector, from charging sector, manufacturers, because every single entity is important for European economy. And right now we are focused on automotive industry. That's 8% of our GDP in Europe. And we know that this 8% is at risk because of the fact that this is changing. Everything is changing, and we are facing a huge transition. But we do not feel that it's a risk for us. It's a chance for us. So in the next couple of years, we should do as much as we can to work together with OEMs, charging manufacturers, CPOs, MSPs, some other companies, to build a real market here in Europe to be seen as leaders.
I hear you call, and I forward it to the audience. So please, everyone, connect with Maciej and Lucie on the Opportunity 35.
Absolutely.
Maybe moving on to regulation and reliability. I already said in the EU we don't have a specific number of laws requiring uptime here already in place, but we do in the US and also in the UK. So maybe let's start over the pond. John, could you first explain to us who you're representing and what's behind Charge X? I find that very interesting. And then maybe also give a little overview of what the regulatory requirements in the US are like today.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. It's after lunch. We're talking about regulation. We need some energy. I'm happy to be here. Today in the United States is our Labor Day holiday. So all of my family are water skiing at home, having fun. So I'm going to have fun in this panel. So come with me. Come on.
Thanks for being
Let's
here.
go. So in the United States, well, so first of all, I work at an organization called the Idaho National Laboratory. It is a US Department of Energy science lab. So you might ask, what is a scientist doing talking about policy and regulation? Well, the US federal government, particularly the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy, have done a lot of work to understand the charging market in the US, to work with Congress to pass legislation to appropriate funding for building charging infrastructure. You may have heard of NEVI and other federal legislation that to provide funding that was part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So first, the government is incentivizing building and deploying charging infrastructure. Second, the US federal government passed the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, to provide incentives to manufacturers and to consumers to both manufacture batteries and electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, and then of course also to purchase EVs. So funding, right? That in the US we talk a lot about the carrot and the stick. Do you use that metaphor in Europe when you talk about regulation?
Yes.
So,
okay, great. So the carrot is, of course, funding. The stick is, of course, requirements. Now, it's important that with federal funding comes requirements that any charging infrastructure that is built is reliable and meets some minimum standards of performance. So primarily, the regulation around charging infrastructure is for that purpose. Finally, the US federal government does not want to just throw money at the problem and throw requirements, but also wants to support industry to meet those requirements and to improve reliability. And that's where I come in. As a scientist, as a manager of a team at multiple national laboratories who have been working in the electric vehicle and charging space for over 20 years, we have brought together the technical experts from industry, from government, along with consumer advocates and other stakeholders to collaborate and work together to identify the biggest problems, the biggest barriers to reliability. So we created the ChargeX consortium. ChargeX stands for Charging Experience. It's more than just reliability. Reliability is the floor. It's step 0. We want to create a positive, even a stellar customer experience for EV drivers when they charge. So I'm excited to talk more about that today and tomorrow.
Yeah. You already gave a really nice overview. Maybe you can finish off by telling us what uptime is required in the US.
Right. So the requirements for charging infrastructure that is funded by federal dollars, by public funds, includes a requirement that individual chargers exceed 97% uptime. That means, frankly, they work, right? As someone said this morning, maybe it was Christian or Stefan, that's not enough. Uptime is necessary, but it's not sufficient. As an EV driver, I don't care if the charger works. I care if it works for me. So the regulation includes uptime, but we hope that industry goes well beyond that to focus on session success every time someone plugs in, that it works.
So we'll talk about the industry in a second, how they respond, but maybe first moving to the UK, it's not only 97, I think it's 99%, right?
Yeah, so hi everyone, Matt Adams, Transport Policy Lead at the REA. So we are...
Can you just share what the REA is?
Yeah, so we are a trade association based in the UK. We represent around 500 member companies, ranging from electric vehicle charging, solar, battery storage, bioenergy, green gas, hydrogen, etc. So anything onshore renewable in the UK, we're involved in somehow or other. But we also, I'm here today representing our EV forum, Recharge UK, that has charge point operators, local government, energy management system providers, the likes of Hubject, other roaming providers, consultancies, recruitment firms, legal firms, finance firms, etc. So yeah, we represent pretty much everyone operating or wanting to operate in the space in the UK. And yeah, on regulation in the UK, we are very thankful to a previous minister who had an EV and was fed up with not being able to charge anywhere. And so he designed a set of regulations to help solve his own problem, which is called the Public Charge Point Regulations 2023. And what that does is require a 99% uptime or reliability rating for all rapid charge point operators. Mm-hmm. So everyone operating on a 50 kilowatt or more charge point has to have a 99% reliability requirement. But yeah, beyond that, it also looks at mandating contactless payment, having open data requirements, and even having a roaming provider as well as part of that. So yeah, it's quite an extensive piece of regulation, actually.
And did it do wonders? What's the effect?
Well, it would be fair to say it's probably too early to tell. So we've had it for about a year so far, and the reliability requirement kicks into force on the 24th of November this year. So we've got a little bit of time left to see what difference it's going to make. But yeah, okay. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Much looking forward to that. Do you have any idea of the effect of your 97% requirement?
Like the program in UK, it's a little early to see the actual data, but we know from a number of independent studies that charging reliability, including uptime, is improving slowly in the United States. I will tell you from working with so many partners in industry there is much, much more focus now on reliability, on uptime, on all of the things beyond uptime. So I can feel in industry that it's coming, it's headed there. We just don't have the numbers to prove it yet.
Okay, so we have to wait. Yeah, looking now back to Europe, what do you guys think of these regulatory requirements? And should the EU follow the lead?
I'm happy to start. Hi, everyone. So I'm Lucie Mattera, the Secretary General of Charge Up Europe. Charge Up is a trade association, a lobby, to put it simply. We are the voice of the EV charging infrastructure industry. A lot of our members are behind me. So we represent CPOs, hardware producers, and MSPs. Okay, so that's who we are. So in the EU, so not Europe, in the EU, there's something very strange happening, right? Which is we do not have EU-level legislation on uptime. That's odd, right? Usually, we're the first to legislate. This time we are behind the UK, behind the US. There's a reason for that. We have a framework that is in place, which is called AFIR, and AFIR regulates public charging in Europe. AFIR would have been the place where uptime requirements could have been, put. But that's not what happened, right? That law has been passed without those uptime requirements. They were considered by the legislative chambers, but that's an option that was not retained. Okay, the EU decided not to go down that route. What they did do was to increase consumer empowerment. Okay, so you still have some consumer-centric within the framework, but they didn't choose to go the way of regulation. They choose to go the way of consumer empowerment, more transparency on price, more transparency on how that price is formed, what you're going to pay, etc. So it's more the route of transparency, make sure the consumer has the information they need to choose the network that works for them. You have a very small mention in the framework, in the recital, that's a non-binding part of the framework that just said, your uptime level should meet the needs of the end user. So it's just very, very vague. That said, AFIR will be reviewed in 2026. Nothing is ever closed with the EU, right? So, it's just the state of play at the moment. AFIR was developed in the context of, it's part of a very broad package of regulations. You have 14 text in that package, and that package is mostly concerned with climate change, right? And we're just a small part of that package, okay? So it's really focused more on deployment rather than, reliability, but that might still come. And just because you do not have action at the EU level doesn't mean that the landscape is static. What we are seeing is a lot of uptime requirements emerging in local tenders, national tenders. So those requirements are coming up, not necessarily from the top down, but from the ground up. So that's something we want to be prepared for.
Yeah, it seems rather unusual that we're also kind of wishing for EU regulation, because as you said, it often ends up being too complicated, not fitting the industry. We already touched upon AFIR this morning. Actually, I felt like there was more of a positive sense towards the AFIR regulation than a negative one. Now you're saying you have this movement sort of from the member countries that start having their own requirements in the tenders. Is that any better? Because it's going to create a piecemeal of a landscape.
Not necessarily, but if you want to counter that as industry without going the route of legislation, then you need to be proactive, right? You need to show that you are taking care of reliability, serious about it, and ready to deploy your own initiatives, structure yourself, and find a path toward increased reliability, which is, I think, a goal that everybody shares. One point I want to flag here, and that's often missed in the debate on reliability, there is this notion we're opposing the interest of consumers and the interest of CPOs. That's just really, really misguided, right? If you're a CPO and your connector is not operational, all that means for you is this is a sunk cost. You've paid for that equipment, you've gone through the extremely painful process of securing that great connection, that took you 2 years, it was really hard and painful, and now that charger is not generating any revenue for you. You are incentivized, the economics of the CPO is to incentivize you to repair the charger and make sure it generates revenue for you. And in that sense, what I'm often hearing, the interest of CPOs and users, EV drivers, are not aligned. That's just not true, right?
Yeah, I wonder, because you said it's also in the interest of the CPO. Why do we actually then need any regulation at all? And maybe looking at the US and the UK, why isn't a competition just doing the job already?
If I can jump in here.
Yes, of course.
That's a very good question, and I think we are all asking this question ourselves. Do we really need to regulate the market? In EU, the market is already over-regulated. For the last 5 years, we were focused on regulating the market. We got Green Deal, we've got 19 different directives and regulations about the transport sector. So the big question is what we can do as an industry and what should be done for the industry by the Commission, for example. So do we really need a kind of a top-down regulation instead of having a free market that will be able to kick off from the market those ones who are not really doing a good job? What we should take into consideration is that a couple of years ago, the market was full of early adopters, and early adopters were really forgiving a lot. They were not making a mess about the fact that charging station is not working. They were sleeping in a car, but they were still happy. Right now, it's all about the mass market. Yeah? Next year, probably every fourth of the new car registered in EU, it's going to be electric. So it's going to be a mass market. And the mass market will not forgive anything. So the question is, do we have even time to wait for EU to regulate the market? And the next question is, what really we mean by regulating the market? So what is uptime on level of 97, 98, 99? What is the definition of reliability in terms of what we can expect from EU? So I think it's not so easy that we'll ask EU, let's regulate it, and then we'll get some proper regulations, because we know, and I can tell you from the perspective of someone who's in Brussels based, and quite often I'm really furious on EU how this process is long. And then I'm back in Warsaw, in my country, and then I'm expecting that all those regulation directives are going to be implemented, and they're not. So it's a very long process. So do we need really to wait for the Commission, or do we need to do something by ourselves?
I guess the problem arises once the member countries start putting in their own rules, and then as a charge point operator, you have to get an overview of what is required in which country, and then start working on these, as you mentioned. But maybe at you, John, from the US, why do you think was there a strong urge to sort of move quickly from a regulatory point of view? Why didn't the competition just kick out those ones that are not that reliable?
This is a very important topic in the United States. You may know that the United States typically takes a hands-off attitude towards the free market. And I personally am a believer in the free market, that markets will solve problems. But let me ask, how many of you in the audience are engineers, by raise of hand? How many of you are on the business side? How many of you are policy advocates or policy experts? Yeah, so just a few. So for the rest of you, I'll give you some policy 101, or basics, because I, with an engineering background, needed to learn this myself. In general, why does a government create regulation, right? Number one, to ensure or protect the common interest, the common good. And so right now in the United States, the Biden administration has made it a very high priority to fight climate change. So therefore, it's in the government is motivated to see that change happens to fight climate change. and accelerate that change. So one reason for regulation around EV charging is to accelerate the pace of the free market. Number two, to answer the question why regulation in general, it's to protect the taxpayer's investment. So all of the money that is being is going towards funding new charging stations is coming from taxpayers. And as a taxpayer, I don't want that money to be wasted, right? So let's put rules in place, let's put requirements in place to make sure that the publicly funded chargers work and they provide a good experience. Finally, to protect the consumer. So safety is very important, of course, and the government in the US often plays a role in protecting or ensuring safety. Number two, to ensure competition, where it's very important to avoid monopolies and so on. So competition, an environment that fosters competition can be created by the government. And then finally, fairness. And Lucie talked about transparency of information, of pricing. There's a lot. We talked earlier about the right to charge. You know, publicly funded charging stations should be open to all taxpayers, right? On and on. So that's my lecture for today. Did I answer your question?
With respect to the funding, you already mentioned it's about taxpayers' money. And you also mentioned the carrot and the stick, meaning that in the US, you also provide funding for maintenance, for actually ensuring uptime. For me, it sounds like the industry will then be like, oh yeah, that's great. Well, I can fulfill the 97% criterion because I also get some money for actually making sure my chargers work. So how is the UK lined up on this? Do you also provide that kind of money for ensuring reliability?
Short answer is no, we don't. But I suppose to give you some context as to why we have the regulatory framework we do have, it's to do with, well, you probably have all heard of like one of our former prime ministers who, well, thankfully he's not here anymore, Boris Johnson, who back in 2020 had decided to mandate a zero emissions vehicle mandate, which sets out that you have to sell a minimum number of electric vehicles per year, and by 2030, 80% of all new car sales will be electric or zero emissions, and by 2035, 100%. And 2024 was the first year that this targets were coming in. I think it's going to be 24% of all new car sales this year have to be electric. But meanwhile, we had feedback that those who were already buying electric vehicles are the early adopters, but even they were struggling with the charging network. And so we needed, now we're going back into the more mainstream market, we needed to have a minimum standard, minimum amount of reliability to ensure that people weren't going to buy an electric vehicle and then send it back and go back to a petrol car or van, especially if we're asking fleets to electrify it. We need to make sure that the network is actually reliable for them. And so the government took the decision to be quite forthright and probably further ahead than other countries per se on regulation. That's why we've got the ZEV mandate, that's why they've gone for PCPR, etc.
So how is the industry in the UK reacting to it? And how are they doing?
Mixed bag, to be fair. When we first had the regulations consulted on back in 2021, 2022, there was quite a good open discourse. But since the regulations have come in, there have been some stumbling blocks, in particular around reliability. What counts as being part of that 99%? What can we exclude? Luckily, as a bit of a exclusive for you guys, I suppose, because I haven't emailed it to our members yet, but OZEV are going to do so that's the Office of Zero Emissions Vehicles, part of the Department for Transport. We'll be doing some workshops on the 18th of September and 10th of October to talk around the regulations and the reliability requirements in particular. So if you are an REA member, you've got an early exclusive there for you. And we'll be sending out some details to you very soon. But I've now lost track of where I was. What was your question?
You were talking about how the industry was doing and responding to the regulation.
Yeah, so what I would say is the industry are doing very well to get up to speed quite quickly, because we've had 12 months to get the reliability to 99%. So we think we're probably going to hit that, but we won't find out till the end of 2025 when the reporting period's over. So it'd be really interesting to see at the end of 2025 if I get a chance to come back another year to give you a bit better insight into how it's actually going.
see what the effect is.
Yeah.
So I guess defining reliability is really difficult. Also, you mentioned, and I guess you guys are also having a lot of talks with the industry about that. So anything, any consensus you're kind of convening to
Yeah.
for the European discussion?
Yeah, just very briefly.
Sorry.
I mean, one of the things we have sort of ruled out is, okay, well, there are certain things that won't be in that 99%. So things like flooding or acts of God, things that are out of your control, definitely won't be counted. Neither will things like vandalism and or, power outages and things like that. So it's not as strict as it looks in the regulations.
So I think that first of all we should establish a kind of code of good practices, because I think that there is a very big question about the methodology and what, as I mentioned before, what do we really mean by reliability and uptime at the level of 97 or 99%. So I think it's up to the industry to do their job right now, and then probably work with the Commission to establish a standardized methodology and to really work on kicking off from the market those ones who are not doing their job. Because I think that we are all having the same story in UK, in USA, in EU, that we are investing a lot public money into charging stations, but it's in some cases, unfortunately, about just having a charging station, not about operating this charging station. So you get money after installing a charging stations, and there are quite a lot of CPOs who are doing a decent job, and I suppose all of them are here. But from the perspective of an EV driver, it's the same charging station if it's owned by a no-name company and not working as Ionity or Allego or any other that is well known. So it's all about the user experience at the end. And if there are gonna be some stations that will not be working or will not be visible on the app, it's about lowering this user experience. And then that's something that the mass market should not accept. So it's gonna be about taking a couple of steps. I think first of all, working on a kind of a code of good practices to establish a methodology, and then probably have this methodology as a part of next half year of. We've got a lot of directives, a lot of other regulations to put this part into and work together to make it happen.
So, Lucie, you want to reply? Maybe also make it as tangible as possible for the audience. What steps are you going to take, and maybe to come into the review of the AFIA 2026?
Yeah, sure. First, just to reiterate the point that John made earlier, which is uptime, which is where most of the policy discussion is at the moment. That's just one small component of reliability. That's just one small metric. And if you want to make sure that the EV driver has a seamless, reliable experience, you need to work way beyond that. We keep using the word uptime as if it were well defined. It's not. There's no standard, industry or otherwise. We did a series of technical workshops with the members of Charge Up Europe to understand a little bit the landscape. What we found is that most CPOs track uptime more or less the same way at the high general level. So they track how often a connector fails versus how much time it is in operation, right? Mm-hmm. And from that ratio, they derive the uptime percentage, right? But how they account for total time and what periods are exempted from that particular formula, this is where you get 50 shades of, uptime definitions, okay? So a good first step, Maciej was just mentioning good practice. A good first step would be to make sure that there's a little bit more convergence toward, a more common way to define and report uptime. Why? Because if you do that, then you have a level playing field. You're now comparing. You're no longer comparing apples and pears, you're comparing peers and peers, right? And so that gives you, transparency on which network is performing better than the other network because everybody is working from the same foundation. It's a clean foundation. There's not holes that are poked everywhere. Everybody is using the same approach, and therefore you can make sure that when you're getting a number from a CPO, from a network, then you can trust this number and you can compare it safely against the CPO, against the number of another CPO. So transparency, a level playing field, making sure that that's the good foundation for competition, and that's how you incentivize CPOs to outperform each other.
John?
That's great to hear, Lucie. I agree completely. The uptime definition in the US has been codified or documented in the Code of Federal Regulation. So if you think this conversation's interesting, you should go to 23 CFR 680.108, and you can learn all about the precise definition of uptime in the United States. Woo! No, but to Lucie's point, at least there is a definition that everyone can read, whether they agree or not. It's establishing an even playing field in the US.
In the US, did actually everyone align on that, or do you have exceptions?
So the federal government interviewed hundreds of CPOs and other stakeholders to inform that definition. There was a public comment period where almost 400 companies provided feedback, and then through the formal rulemaking process, we say that that definition was established with a lot of input.
But you have no states that are sort of doing their own thing and like upping the requirement from 97 to 99.
Good question. So the uptime requirement in federal regulation is a minimum requirement. States can add additional requirements, such as increasing the uptime,
So
but the underlying definition stays
the
same.
same.
Yeah.
I guess that's a really important factor. So moving away maybe from like solid law requirements, what else can sort of regulation or policy making do in terms of improving reliability, helping the CPO without sort of dictating what he has to do?
Can we talk about standards?
Go for
Getting
it.
more
If there was another topic that's more exciting than regulation, it's standards. So oftentimes the private sector will complain to the government about standards by saying, you're stifling innovation. Raise your hand if you've said that before. You're stifling my innovation, right? But studies have shown that if we establish some boundaries to our playing field, to our sector, that innovation actually increases or flourishes within that space. So right now, the regulation in the US establishes ISO 15118 as the standard for communication between the vehicle and the charger. It establishes OCPP as the standard protocol between the charger and the back end, and OCPI between one CPO and another CPO. And by unifying the industry around those three standards, yes, it's true they're not perfect, but it builds a critical mass to fix those two and improve those standards and get everyone moving in the same direction. And that's having a big impact right now.
Makes a lot of sense.
I mean, if we talk about like other ways of regulating, instead of standards, go down the specification route, which is almost just as exciting as that, because a specification is like a standard, apart from it has no teeth at all. So it's very much just guidance that you can choose to go by or not. And in the UK, we have quite a few different publicly available specifications. In particular, there's one on accessibility, PAS 1899, that sort of helps charge point operators understand how to build a charge point that's more accessible for disabled users, which is fantastic. The problem has been, though, with the PAS, has been actually it's very difficult to execute because the charge point operator doesn't have control necessarily of where their charge points are located, so they can't control the surrounding space, and therefore you can have an accessible charge point, but if the parking space is still too narrow, it doesn't make any difference. And so at some point we have to speak about, instead of regulating the CPOs, how we can regulate the landowners as well to actually help with this. But that's another conversation.
Fun.
Maybe as a very, very quick closing round, I'd like to ask, what you wish to know from the industry in order to help them to move forward. Because we have another 1.5 days here together. So what do you want to know from those guys out there? Who wants to start? To help them move forward, to become more reliable. John.
What's the problem with roaming? Why can't we get roaming? We talked about that this morning. I had a boss once who told me, John, if you don't give management a plan, they will make a plan for you. And I see that a lot with regulation. If the industry can't come together and come up with a solution for roaming, then the government is going to feel compelled to create one, right? So that everyone has the right to plug, as we heard this morning, has the right to see information about the charging, so price, real-time status, so that there's some basic ability to access and pay for, the right to pay. I would love to hear from you in the European market what the challenges are for establishing universal roaming so that I can take that back to my colleagues in the US.
Thank you.
I can be the second one. I think that there is one quick, let's say, quick and easy solution to make the situation better, building more and more charging stations, actually. Because in all of the cases when you've got a very big charging hub with a lot of stalls, even if one is not working, the other ones are working. And that's why, for example, why Tesla superchargers in California are doing a great job, because you've got 20, 30, 40, 50 in one location. So I think that the first thing is going to be having more and more charging stations being subsidized by the EU or the state money. And what I would ask the industry, I think about the methodology, because we need to have a common standardized methodology to really know what we are looking for in terms of 97, 98, 99% uptime. That's crucial to be entirely on the same page when we are thinking about having any kind of standards. Because without having this discussion, then probably in the next couple of years, someone is going to do it for us.
You. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to our members, I would ask, tell me if you're okay for me to name and shame those networks that don't perform well, because we're...
Watch out, everyone.
No, I mean, if you say, well, we don't like, the regulatory road, and that's the charter position, we don't like the regulatory road, but then what do you do to elevate the level of performance in the industry? Then, you also have to be prepared to put a little bit of pressure where that's needed.
So what you're saying is like, let's avoid the regulation, but maybe...
Be proactive, still elevate the game, not through regulation, but elevate the game, and industry need to figure out how.
By creating transparency, who might not be doing so well.
Starting with that.
Yeah. So I suppose I've spoken a lot about UK regulation and how it's clearly, I'd like to know, is UK regulation stymieing you from being able to invest in the UK market if you're a European-based business? Or is it quite comforting knowing you've actually got in writing exactly what it is you need to be able to do to invest in the UK? So, yeah.
Good one. Thank you very much, guys. I'd like to open up the discussion to the audience. We've heard a lot about laws and standards and protocols. Are there any questions in the audience, and do we have questions from the online sphere? Please raise your hand, and we will have microphones being brought to you. There's one question over here.
Jan Rode from Shell. I suppose if we are talking about reliability requirements, we are talking about requirements for the CPO. But there are many other players in the value chain, like hardware manufacturers, payment service providers, grid operators, provider of data connections. Are you planning to make them accountable or hold them accountable as well?
Good one.
From a regulatory perspective, that's very difficult because, at least in the US, different government agencies have responsibility, or rather authority, over automakers versus CPOs. In the US, the only regulation that applies to charging is put into place if a CPO receives federal funding to build a charging station. So that automatically puts the focus on the CPO. But I totally agree with you, Jan, is it? That there are so many stakeholders involved. If you look at the specific definition of uptime in the US, it includes a component that if the vehicle is at fault, the CPO is exempted from downtime. Now that's hard to do and it's hard to measure in practice, but at least it's an indication of, or a recognition of the automaker's role in the process. So very important to include, hold all of the stakeholders accountable, but it's difficult to do in practice.
And probably we should even avoid over-regulating the market, and we should focus on working together to really avoid having more and more regulations. In Europe, it takes a couple of years to implement a directive or a regulation. So the question is, do we have time to regulate every single part of the market? In my opinion, we do not have. We should work on a methodology, work on a kind of a code of good practices, and then as an industry be the ones who are going to be responsible for the final effect. So we do not want to over-regulate the market in EU. I think that should be our goal.
Yeah, I suppose I should say that in the UK, I mean, there are a lot of regulations, but a lot of them apply to the EMSPs and others as well. But I suppose, yeah, we haven't looked at reliability so far beyond the CPO. But I suppose people might argue, well, you know, if your charge point does have a weak pulse, then maybe you'd go buy a new charge point, go to a new charge point manufacturer or something like that instead. But obviously, that's it's still difficult. But maybe that's what the government would say at the moment, at least.
We have a question at the back. Already.
Hello, my name is Achim Friedland from Craft Defined. I have one simple question about the elephant in this room. When the entire industry cannot comply to existing cybersecurity regulation, why do you expect that they can comply to any other regulation in the future? And when the industry often tries to play regulations and work actively against governments, why do you think the industry will change?
Because if the industry doesn't change, we will all be out of jobs. I'm dead serious. If we want this market to exist,
there will be no mass market. Yeah.
Yeah. In so 3 to 5 years, we must improve.
We all lose.
The government doesn't need to regulate that. It's in everyone's interest to be cyber secure, to be reliable, and to provide a stellar customer experience. Otherwise, back to gas.
We touched upon cybersecurity in the keynote before. Is there any regulation in? I don't exactly. I'm not an expert on cybersecurity regulation. So where do we stand there? Do we have what sort of in place?
Go ahead.
Yes, there are some requirements that are linked to cybersecurity. It's actually a very live discussion that we're also having with some transmission operators and distribution system operators, so also quite confidential.
So we're moving.
But yeah. For offshore, of course, cybersecurity is a key topic. Of course, industries compliant with requirements. Voilà, so I don't subscribe to the premise of that question.
Yeah, okay. We have a question from the audience, from the online space. 3 years in, which states are leading efforts in the US to set up reliable EV charging stations under the NEVI program? How does the adoption trend look like for designated AFCs with charging stations which do not match the requirements of the program?
Interesting. So I can answer that once I understand it. How does the adoption trend look for designated AFCs with charging stations which do not match the requirements?
What does AFC stand for?
So for federal funds that are given to CPOs in the NEVI program. The funding flows from the federal government in the US to the states, so all 50 states plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. And the state departments of transportation have the opportunity to add additional requirements, and then they choose the CPOs to fund. And the states are required to direct the funding towards building stations along alternative fuel corridors. So basically highways that were designated for alternative fuels. The states are not allowed to send the money to CPOs to build on other locations. So the states are all following the requirements of the program to build on those designated highways. So that's not a problem. There are some states who are going a little slower, who want to learn more about the best locations to put chargers along those highways. There are some states who are moving faster. I would hesitate to identify the states that are moving faster as the ones that are leading the effort, because not all 50 states started it in the same place. So my home state of Idaho has very few EVs. The state government did not spend much time thinking about EVs because there were not many EV owners in the state. But I have been working personally with my state government to develop a robust plan to build charging stations across the state. So I'm excited to have an opportunity to charge all over.
So generally, for NEVI, how was the response in the US sort of?
Almost everywhere it was very positive. There are a few states that aren't ready for EVs yet, but they are still participating. They're still accepting the federal dollars and working towards a plan.
But also in the industry?
Yes.
Yeah, I find that, yeah.
Money talks.
That's quite obvious.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? There's one over there.
Hi, Dustin Shell, California Energy Commission. My question is for Matt Adams. In the UK, how are they tracking uptime? And I just want to clarify that your regulation applies to all publicly available fast chargers. It is not restricted to publicly funded fast chargers.
So yeah, it's all publicly available fast chargers. And in terms of how they're tracking it, well, we're probably going to find out in a few weeks' time, essentially, so I can't answer it now. But so, as I say, the regulations are going to come in on the 24th of November this year, and we're expected to have some industry workshops over the next few weeks where they'll sort of give us a better understanding of how they're going to do it. But they do have a very handy formula for how they're going to calculate it, which is total number of minutes in a year, which, as we all know, is right 526,000. Minus the downtime, minus the exemptions, times by 100. So that's how they're going to calculate it, at least.
Which is the same in the US.
Yeah.
At least that's sort of fitting together. Sadly, we haven't gotten it on screen, the formula, but we'll get it. Any more questions from the audience? There's one at the back.
Hello, Christoph Stürmer. Does it make any sense to require static uptime performance? Wouldn't it be rather interesting to regulate the amount of refused charging attempts?
Yeah, so you're getting at the idea that regardless of whether the charger is up, is working, is operational, what really matters to the individual customers is when I try to start a session, does it work, right? And that's why I said at the beginning, uptime is the floor. It's the minimum requirement, right? We need to do much more as an industry to ensure every session works every time.
Perfect. Anyone else on this?
It's clear.
We would have just enough seconds for one last question, but you have to be very quick. If not, I think we're just on time. Perfect. Thank you so much, guys, for a great discussion. A warm round of applause, please.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Johanna.
Thank you.